Blog Talk Radio.
And welcome to Healing X Outreach Radio. I am your host, Augustin Anastacio. That song is Nailed to the Cross. It's by Rush of Fools. You can get free downloads at cyiworldwide.com and also praisecharts.com. You can get free music. Also worshiptogether.com. I get a lot of these free downloads for the show from all three of those sites. praisecharts.com, cyiworldwide.com, and also worshiptogether.com, just to let you know. Next week, we will be having a special guest, and actually, let me just share this information with you guys today, right now. James Kostelnick is the author of a book called Wolves Among Sheep, the true story of a murder in a Jehovah's Witness community. You can get it on Amazon.com, and I will be having him as a guest for an interview in September, and I will give you the date. The date is September 20th. That's the week before I go to the Witnesses Now for Jesus conference. So on September 20th, look forward to having James Kostelnick, the author of that book, and sadly, the victim of a terrible tragedy. And you can watch a program about that terrible tragedy on, if you have a cable or satellite TV, it's on Investigation Discovery Channel, and it will be airing at 9 a.m. tomorrow. It aired on Wednesday. It aired on Friday night, 9 a.m. tomorrow morning. It's called Deadly Devotion Season 2. I guess that's the programming, and it's called Witness to Murder. And I'm reading it right there from investigationdiscovery.com, their TV shows listing schedule. Kim Anderson, a divorced mother of two and devout Jehovah's Witness, finally finds the man of her dreams, but on their wedding day, she has a sinking feeling that something is terribly wrong. And as you heard from the Wolves Among Sheep, unfortunately, Kim Anderson lost her life and her two children. And James was married to Kim at one point when he, of course, rejected the teachings of the Watchtower Society. She eventually divorced him, married a devout Jehovah's Witness, and it led to a lot of issues with abuse and eventually her death and the death of his two daughters. So we will have James on September 20th, once again, 12 o'clock, normal time. And so I'm looking forward to that interview in September. And definitely check that out for tomorrow morning. Put it on your DVR if you're not going to be up at 9 a.m. or if you're going to be in church tomorrow morning. The other thing I want to announce is that I'm in the process of getting Nestor and Tony, who served, and I forgot their last names, but I know them as Nestor and Tony, a couple who served at Brooklyn Bethel Watchtower headquarters with Chris and Norma Sanchez. If you don't know who Chris and Norma Sanchez are, all four of these people were Spanish translators of the New World Translation Bible. And Randy just really gave me the hookup. I spoke to Nestor on Sunday of last week. We're going to be getting them on sometime in September, if not the first Saturday in September, maybe the second Saturday. So look for either the 6th or the 13th to have Nestor and Tony and what they're going to share about what happened in 1980 at Watchtower headquarters that caused a huge shuffle. Of course, we know what happened. Randy exited Watchtower headquarters as a result of the things that were happening at headquarters. Raymond Franz, former member of the governing body, also winded up, and it was considered the 1980 witch hunt. And so it was a huge shakeup in Watchtower headquarters in 1980, and we're going to get a really, really deep inside scoop from Nestor and Tony, who served as Spanish translators, and what happened with how this all began from translating their Bible into Spanish and what they discovered. So looking forward, really, really forward to that programming coming up. Also, next week we will have Carrie B., and she is the author of a book. And let me just get her information out real quick. Next week we're going to have a 12 p.m. program with Carrie B., and I'm pulling it up as we speak. Computer's a little slow. And she has authored it's a book that's a type of memoir. And it's at next Saturday, 12 o'clock, and I'll give you the title of her book. Her book is also available on Amazon now, and it's a fictionalized memoir of Ivy Carley, a girl coming of age in the Jehovah's Witness religious organization. Her book is entitled Paradise Bound. And at the time when I wrote this, it was due for release in July. It has come out now. It's in August. We are in August. It has come out. And you can learn more about her book at carriesammons.wix.com/paradisebound, and like her Facebook page, which is entitled Paradise Bound by Carrie B. So just search for her Facebook page and check out her book also on Amazon. And we're going to interview her next week about her book and about her character. And I believe that her character is somewhat based upon her own personal life. So without further ado, I want to talk about today. Today we have a debate, and we have Turretinfan and William Albrecht. William Albrecht is from the Catholic Legate, and he is an apologist for the Roman Catholic Church. The Catholic Legate is a Catholic apostolate, and he has a BA in theology, and you can learn more about him on his YouTube page or CatholicGate.com, youtube.com/GNRhead, and also Turretinfan. We've had several debates, and he also has a webpage, turretinfan.blogspot.com, and youtube.com/user/Turretinfan, and he also has a Facebook page. So check those out. And today's debate is going to be a 2-hour debate, and it's on the subject of the sacrifice of the Mass. Is it Christian or just invented tradition? So without further ado, I want to welcome both Turretinfan and William on the air. Gentlemen, you're both on the air.
Oh, thanks very much.
Yeah, okay, I'm here.
So that's Turretinfan and that's William. So just letting our listeners know our debate format. We have 2 openings, then we have 2 rebuttals, and then we will have 6 cross-exams, and then we will have 2 closing statements and a 24-minute Q&A, so the listeners can call in and ask questions from both gentlemen or one of the 2 gentlemen concerning the issues of the debate about the sacrifice of the Mass and whether it's Christian or just invented tradition. So, and one last thing before I got to throw a plug for my sponsor. We do have a sponsor. It's Audible.com, and they are my sponsor for this Healing X Outreach show. And you can, the listening device that you're listening to right now, You can listen to a lot of their products. They are a leading provider of spoken digital audio entertainment and information. They have over 150,000 titles to choose from. You can listen to them on any device, including whatever you're hearing us on right now. And if you sign up at our URL, which is audibletrial.com/HealingXOutreach, you get one free audiobook and a 1-month trial of the service. So let me go ahead and find our debate ring. And we do have a 2 7-minute openings and then 2 5-minute rebuttals. And this is the debate ring for everyone to listen to. And, of course, we'll know that means that, the person speaking should try to wrap it up. William, you're taking the defense on this, right? So you would start, right?
Yeah, I believe that I would begin, and I believe Turretinfan would be closing. Am I correct with that, Turretin?
Yes.
That's fine with me.
Okay. Yeah, we can go that route, and it really can be flexible. It really doesn't matter. But, yeah, I'll go ahead and I'll open.
Okay.
Okay. Should I go ahead and start already?
You can start right now.
Okay. All right, well, I want to thank Gus, and I want to thank Turretinfan for their time once again. And I want to start off real quickly by reading a little bit of what Ludwig Ott tells us in regards to the sacrifice of the Mass. And as Ludwig Ott reflects, and appropriately, covering both the ancient Orthodox and Catholic churches, he tells us that the Holy Mass is a true and a proper sacrifice, de fide. He goes forward to pointing the sacrificial character of the Eucharist. He tells us that this is the very fact that Christ made his body and his blood present under separate forms and thus in the form of a sacrifice. The separate forms symbolically represent the real separation of the body and the blood of Christ, which was made in the sacrifice of the cross. The words of institution attest the sacrificial character of the Eucharist. Christ designates his body a sacrificial body, and his blood sacrificial blood, when he declares, "This is my body, which will be given up for you."
Hey, can I interrupt for a minute? William, you're breaking up a little bit, so I want to make sure that everybody gets to hear you. So I don't know if you need to go to another area in the room that you're in to get a stronger signal.
Was I breaking up for you as well, Turretin?
I was hearing it okay, but...
okay.
Yeah, I've got...
It could be just me then. All righty.
Did I break up at all, or was I pretty clear, Turretin?
It's breaking a little bit, but the opening music was breaking a little bit for me too, so I wasn't sure if it was just my connection. But I can hear, I can understand what you're saying. Yeah. Oh,
okay. If it continues to break up, I can pop onto another line. So
what's funny is right now you're completely clear.
Really odd.
Yeah.
Okay. I was at about 1 minute 20, so let me go right back to where I was at. Okay.
Fine.
The words of institution attest the sacrificial character of the Eucharist. Christ designates his body a sacrificial body, and his blood sacrificial blood, when he declares, "This is my body, which shall be given up for you, and this is my blood, which shall be shed for you." The expressions "to give up the body," "to shed blood" are biblical sacrificial terms, which express the oblation of a true and proper sacrifice. Again, Christ designates his blood as the blood of the covenant. As the old covenant of God with Israel was concluded by the proffering of bloody sacrifice, the blood of the covenant is synonymous, according to the biblical conception, with blood of sacrifice. That the action of the sacrifice is consummated in the present time is indicated by the present form of the participles denomenon and ekunomenon, even if these do not exclude a reference to the proximate future. Okay. Going forward, I want to point out how Ludwig also points out that the mandate, "Do this in memory of me," or commemoration of me, shows that the Eucharistic sacrifice is to be a permanent institution of the New Testament. Furthermore, if we examine 1 Corinthians 11:26, we read, "For whenever you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death comes." And, of course, most of the times when I will be referencing Scripture, I will be referencing a Protestant rendering in the New International Version in this particular area. Covering this biblical passage, in the original Greek rendering, we have the term husakis, for whenever. The term literally means as often as. Paul here clearly notes that the representation of the Lord's Supper will not be a one-time event. The actual sacrificial meal will be a continual, ongoing event. But where is the proof that the meal itself was a sacrifice? Well, now that we've established that the meal was meant to be perpetual, we must solidly prove that it was indeed a sacrificial meal. And our next pit stop of examination would be the Greek word anamnesis. We're really getting down to business when we cover that word. Well, you might be wondering, why is this word so important? After all, it only appears a select few times in the New Testament. First off, one of the places where it does appear is Luke 22:19, which reads, "And he took bread, gave thanks, and broke it, and gave it to them, saying, 'This is my body given for you. Do this in remembrance of me.'" The same term, nearly mirrored, is found in 1 Corinthians 11:24 and 25. We can also find it in Hebrews 10:3, which reads, "But those sacrifices are an annual reminder of sins." Moving forward, in Luke, Corinthians, and Hebrews, the same term anamnesis is used for remembrance and reminder. The term actually means a sacrificial remembrance, and that is how it is precisely used. Hebrews 10:3 is actually referring to the sacrifices that were done under the law, specifically found in the expositions on Leviticus 16:7, 14, and 15, and verse 30. These were the sacrifices that brought to a remembrance, an anamnesis, a sacrificial remembrance of the sins of the people. Moving on to Matthew 26:28, another Eucharistic passage. While they were eating, Jesus took bread, gave thanks, and broke it, and gave it to his disciples, saying, Take, eat, this is my body. Then he took the cup, gave thanks, and offered it to them, saying, Drink from it, all of you. This is my blood. This is my blood. Literally reading in the Greek, ekounomenon. This literally is rendered in the Greek, which is being poured out for the forgiveness of sins. The blood of Christ is actually being poured out at that exact Eucharistic moment for the remission of sins. The Greek word aphesis for forgiveness and the Greek word hamartia for sins. There is no doubt that this is in a sacrificial context. Shed blood for the remission of sins is a common theme in the Bible. Scripture is clear that the Last Supper was to be practiced onward, not simply one time. The Eucharistic words are clear to be repetitive, and the language is clearly sacrificial. So what must we conclude? If we were to logically stop and piece the puzzles of what we examined together, it is logical to assume this. The Last Supper was a presentation of the representation that was meant to be done more than once, as shown earlier. The Eucharistic wording is clearly sacrificial. The blood is poured out for the forgiveness of sins. And as Jesus says in John 6:55, "For my flesh is real food, and my blood is real drink." As the debate progresses, we will see that not only do the pre-Nicene witnesses, but the Nicene witnesses and the post-Nicene witnesses all favor a sacrificial interpretation of the classic Eucharistic passages. I will now surrender whatever might be left of the rest of my time to my opponent and my friend, Turretinfan.
Very well. Okay, Turretinfan, you can begin at any time right now.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks very much. And I suppose the one response that should be offered immediately is, of course, there is sacrificial language used to describe the Lord's Supper because the Lord's Supper is a reminder of Christ's sacrificial death. Today I'll explore the question of whether the Lord's Supper is a sacrifice itself and not just a reminder of the Lord's sacrifice. Under basically two main headings, the first heading being Scripture, the second heading being reason. The first subject, Scripture. The sacrifice of Christ was once for all. Perhaps the most emphatic part of the Bible that teaches this is Hebrews chapters 9 and 10. Unfortunately, time doesn't permit me to read all of the text of both of those chapters right now, but let me give you some highlights that prove the point. First, Hebrews 9:12. He entered in once into the holy place, having obtained eternal redemption for us. Again, verses 25 to 26 of the same chapter. Nor yet that he should offer himself often, as the high priest entereth into the holy place every year with blood of others, for then must he often have suffered since the foundation of the world. But now, once, in the end of the world, hath he appeared to put away sin by the sacrifice of himself. Verses 27 to 28. And as it is appointed unto men once to die, but after this the judgment, so Christ was once offered to bear the sins of many. And to them that look for him shall he appear the second time without sin unto salvation. And again, verse 10 of chapter 10, by the which will we are sanctified through the offering of the body of Jesus Christ once for all. And verse 12, but this man, after he had offered one sacrifice for sins forever, sat down on the right hand of God. Verse 14, for by one offering he hath perfected forever them that are sanctified. We can also see this maybe in starker contrast when you look at the first three verses together of chapter 10. For the law, having a shadow of good things to come and not the very image of the things, can never, with those sacrifices which they offered year by year, continually make the comers thereunto perfect, for then would they not have ceased to be offered, because that the worshippers once purged should have no more conscience of sin, but in those sacrifices there is a remembrance again made of sins every year. So in other words, here it doesn't explicitly say once, but it says if they would have done the job, they would have ceased. The implication is Jesus has done it and it's now ceased. Hebrews 10, 16 to 18, this is the covenant I will make with them after those days, saith the Lord. I will put my laws into their hearts, and in their minds will I write them, and their sins and iniquities will I remember no more. Now, where remission of these is, there is no more offering for sin. So now we've got explicit, what was implied in the first three verses, we have explicit, there is no more offering for sin. So, according to Scripture, there was one sacrifice, and that has ceased, it is no more, it's done, it's finished. Reason itself confirms this principle. There's a fundamental problem with the sacrifice model of the Mass. You need death to occur. To make a sacrifice, you need something to be immolated, something to be destroyed, something to die. This is reflected in the text. Hebrews 9:16 says, for where a testament is, there must also of necessity be the death of the testator. And that's relevant because, as you know, the supper does present to us Christ's death, and it's even the term in Luke 22:20 and in 1 Corinthians 11:25, the cup is called the cup. This is the cup, the New Testament in my blood. So in other words, there is a sacrificial character to what the sacrament represents and what it reminds us of. And that thing that we're reminded of is Christ's death, which is shown until he comes, or proclaimed until he comes, if you use the translation I think that was used in Albrecht's opening. This death doesn't take place in the Mass. Christ is not killed again and again. And as far as I'm aware, Mr. Albrecht didn't say that that's the Roman Catholic view, that he's killed over and over again. And as far as I know, it isn't the Roman Catholic view that he's killed over and over again. But that doesn't solve the problem it only solves the problem that you're saying you're not claiming that Christ died more than once. Well, what it doesn't solve is it doesn't change a non-sacrifice into a sacrifice. Is there any immolation or any death or any destruction that takes place in the Mass? The only thing that's destroyed in the Mass is the substance of the bread and the substance of wine, which are supposedly replaced by the substance of the body and blood and divinity and soul of Jesus Christ. But if that's the case, then the thing being destroyed, the victim of the sacrifice, would be the element of bread and wine, and not the body and blood of Christ, since those aren't killed or destroyed, nor do they die in the Mass. So there's a fundamental rational problem with the sacrifice model of the Mass, and on top of the scriptural problem that the Scripture clearly says over and over again in Hebrews 9 and 10 that there's only one sacrifice, and that it's once for all, that it's ceased, that it is there's no more offering for sin. Is there a sacrifice in the supper, though? Yes, actually, you may be surprised that I'll take this position, but there is. Romans 12:1 says, I beseech you, therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present your body as a living sacrifice, wholly acceptable unto God, which is your reasonable service. And again, Philippians 2:17, yea, and if I be offered upon the sacrifice and service of your faith, I rejoice and rejoice with you all. Or Hebrews 13:5, by him, therefore, offer the sacrifice of praise to God continually, that is, the fruit of our lips, giving thanks to his name. Now, shortly let me give you one more while we still have time. 1 Peter 2:5, ye also as lively stones are built up a spiritual house and holy priesthood to offer up spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God by Jesus Christ. So in the coming rebuttal, hopefully I'll be able to respond to Mr. Albrecht's points and as well to any patristic references he alluded to that may be forthcoming. Thanks.
Okay, very well. Okay, so then we can begin with the rebuttal period. It will be 2 5-minute rebuttals, beginning with William Albrecht. So, William, you can begin your rebuttal of 5 minutes right now.
Okay, great. All right. I want to thank Turretinfan for that his opening. And I want to go quick into Turretinfan tells us that the Last Supper is a reminder of the sacrifice, not a sacrifice itself. Well, I want to go right back to the passage in Matthew chapter 26, and perhaps we'll cover it more in depth whenever we go through the cross-examination. But I want to remind him of the blood that is being poured out, and I want to remind him of the sacrificial contents that is being used. I would suggest that he go over that passage once more, and I would really recommend he also look up and see what the fathers say about these passages. But going forward, the sacrifice of Christ was once for all. That is definitely correct. And it is also correct when 1 Corinthians 11:26 tells us, for whenever you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes. And that is exactly what Malachi 1:11 said, where it tells us, it actually speaks of a prophecy, and this prophecy is basically adopted by the early fathers to be a reference to the holy sacrifice of the Mass. And going forward, Turretinfan says, reading the passage, he reads that he entered once into the holy place, having once received eternal redemption for us. And let me be clear for people that are listening. We must listen to what the early ancient churches tell us. This is not another sacrifice. And this is, as Augustine tells us, when he says, affirming that Christ was sacrificed once for all. You see, people, these arguments have already been answered. They've been answered in the early church. Augustine asks, was not Christ once for all offered up in his own person as a sacrifice? He then goes on to speak of the sacraments, in particular the sacrament of the Eucharist. And he says, for if sacraments had not some points of real resemblance to the things of which they are the sacraments, they would not be sacraments at all. In most cases, moreover, they do in virtue of the likeness bear the name of the realities that they resemble. As therefore, in a certain manner, the sacrament of Christ's body is Christ's body, and the sacrament of Christ's blood is Christ's blood. So the argument that Turretinfan has placed has been answered. It was answered in the early church. This is not another offering. Christ is not being re-sacrificed. As Ambrose tells us, even if one does not now see that Christ is sacrificed, still he himself was sacrificed on earth. Whenever the body of Christ is sacrificed, it is obvious that he even offers himself in us. For his word sanctifies the sacrifice which is offered. Ambrose goes on to say, we are able, being priests of the priesthood, and we offer the sacrifice on behalf of the people. Chrysostom, in his work in the priesthood, tells us, when you see the Lord immolated and lying upon the altar, and the priest bent over that sacrifice praying, and all the people empurpled by the precious blood, can you think that you are still among men and on earth? Or are you lifted up to heaven? Ladies and gentlemen, the early church has already answered these objections. They've already answered the objections of the once for all, Christ died once for all. Nobody in the early church argued that this was a re-sacrificing of Christ. Come on now. We've heard that argument over and over. Surely Protestantism can present something better. These arguments have been refuted, long refuted. Before my own family tree existed, these arguments were taken to task by the early church. Turretinfan is also incorrect, that sacrifice does not entail the ongoing death of someone. To say this is not only a betrayal of the usage of the term sacrifice, but a distortion of what the key Greek term anamnesis means, which is connected to the Eucharistic passages. Hebrews 9 and 10 speak of one sacrifice. But if Turretinfan is acknowledging that the Orthodox and Catholic churches are not arguing for another sacrifice, then what is the point of bringing that up? Is it because he believes that we are re-sacrificing Christ, or perhaps that we believe this is another sacrifice? Well, then I would point to him to the prophecy of Malachias, and I would point out the fact that this passage was adopted by Augustine, adopted by Justin Martyr, the Didache, John of Damascus, Irenaeus, Tertullian, the Apostolic Constitutions, all of them adopting this and showing that this was written and mentioned as a prophetic fulfillment of the Eucharist. And I realize that my time is coming up, and I will surrender the rest of my time to Turretinfan. Thank you.
Okay, Turretinfan, you can begin your 5-minute rebuttal right now.
I just want to butt in real quick. I have not been cracking up, have I?
No. You sound clear. Crystal clear now.
Great.
Yep.
Okay. Thanks for the rebuttal period. I guess the first thing I should deal with in my rebuttal are these quotations presented from Augustine. The first quotation mentions Augustine talking about how the sacraments have a real resemblance to the things that they represent. But Augustine isn't saying that the supper actually is the death of Christ, rather that it in a way resembles the death of Christ. So unfortunately, that particular quotation says almost exactly opposite of what it would need to say to support the Roman Catholic position. The second point of the rebuttal is the question of whether we must listen to the early church. Of course, we ought to hear what they have to say. We ought to evaluate what they say, but of course we shouldn't blindly accept what they said simply because they came before us and their writings happened to survive down to the modern day. Simply being ancient doesn't guarantee that one is orthodox, and in fact, as we discover ancient heretical writings like the Nag Hammadi literature, we wouldn't accord any special weight to the Nag Hammadi literature simply because it's very old. Instead, the truth must be determined from the sources of infallible truth, namely the scriptures. And what we've missed is any kind of scriptural argument that would support the conclusion that what we have here is an ongoing sacrifice. In fact, I've already shown you from Hebrews 9 and 10 that there was one sacrifice, that it was once for all, and that it's completed, that it's ceased, that it's done. It does not continue, it's finished. What does continue is our remembrance of it. Now, if it's only a remembrance of the thing that's now past, which is what it says remembrance, maybe we'll have to explore this question of what anamnesis means in the cross-examination section, but if it's a remembrance of the thing that's past, then the thing is past. It seems as though, as well, when we talk about something proclaiming Christ's death till he comes, that means it describes it. It shows forth it. It illustrates it. It's, to use the words of, to use a little bit of a metaphor here, it's an icon of Christ's crucifixion. That we have, it's the only authorized icon of Christ. It actually shows us Christ's body and blood. It illustrates his death until he comes. There's another question in there about that this is the cup of the New Testament which is shed for you. In other words, which is being shed for you. Of course, this is done the day before the crucifixion. I think it might be, we might have to explore this question of the linguistic tense and whether it can be used about events that are just about to occur as opposed to ones that are occurring at the exact moment of speech, with some other examples perhaps of verbs used this way where something's about to happen and it's described as though it's already happening. But suffice to say that it is a general principle of prophetic speech to speak about things which are to come as though they've already happened. And the Lord's Supper, in any event, does point us forward to the cup that was at that time, although not exactly at that moment. He wasn't actually dying on the cross before he died on the cross. But although it was not exactly at the same time, it was approximately at the same time. He died very soon after the Lord's Supper was initially instituted. There seemed to be some misunderstanding about the need for death in sacrifice. Sacrifice requires something to be immolated. And some of the quotations seem to reflect that. Some, at least one of them talks about the priest being leaning over the immolated Christ, which would be, if it was meant literally, would entail Christ dying. If he is immolated, that means he is dying. The problem is that Roman Catholicism doesn't. There's two sides to this sword. On the one side, they don't affirm that Christ dies over and over again, which means on the other side of the sword that they don't have an actual sacrifice. Because they don't have a sacrifice, the Mass can't be a sacrifice, but they say it is, which implies that Christ's dying over and over again, but they say he's not dying over and over again. So one side of the sword or the other side of the sword hits them. It's a two-edged sword, and that's the point of that argument. Hopefully it will be clear enough, and we can clarify it more in cross-examination if need be. Finally, about Malachi, that text does indeed talk about a sacrifice, but not the sacrifice that at issue in this discussion. Rather, it talks about the sacrifice of ourselves that we offer. And I've already illustrated that from Romans, Philippians, and Hebrews 13:15. And I believe that uses up my 5 minutes.
Okay. Thank you.
Great.
And so we can begin with the cross exams, and there will be 6 cross exams, 3 apiece, and 6 minutes long. And William, you can begin with your first cross exam of Turretinfan.
Wonderful. All right, Turretinfan, thank you for that rebuttal. Can you read Malachi 1:11 for us, please?
Yes.
Great.
For from the rising of the sun, even unto the going down of the same, my name shall be great among the Gentiles, and in every place incense shall be offered unto my name, and a pure offering. For my name shall be great among the heathen, saith the Lord of hosts.
Okay, Turretinfan, I'm curious. This is more of a curious cross-examination question. I didn't plan on asking this, but have you done a historical study on the historical interpretation of that passage?
I've done. I don't know. I've done an amateur study of it, and I came across a very interesting writing attributed to Irenaeus on that very subject. But I can't say that I've done an absolutely extensive survey.
Okay, my question to you is, I guess, let me narrow it down a little bit. Can you name one father or one early ancient source that interprets Malachi 1:11 in a context that is contrary to it being Eucharistic?
Sure. Yes. So the fragments. This is the source of this quotation is from it's called the Fragments from the Lost Writings of Irenaeus, which because it's fragments and because it's hard to guarantee that it's really Irenaeus. I wanted to make sure that's clear up front. It's just that we can view it just as an old Christian writing, and whether it's truly Irenaeus or not, I would set that aside. But this one says, this is an example of this, says, those who have been acquainted with the secondary constitutions of the apostles are aware that the Lord instituted a new oblation in the new covenant, according to Malachi the prophet. For from the rising of the sun even to the setting, my name has been glorified among the Gentiles, and in every place incense is offered to my name in a pure sacrifice, quoting Malachi 1:11. As John also declares in the Apocalypse, the incense is the prayers of the saints. Then again, Paul exhorts us, quote, to present our bodies a living sacrifice, holy, acceptable unto God, which is your reasonable service. And again, let us offer the sacrifice of praise, that is, the fruit of the lips, Hebrews 13:15. Now, those oblations are not according to... I'm sorry. I guess the point is those are exactly what I had argued that the sacrifice is.
I understand. Okay. Let me just be certain. This would, I guess, at best be dubious. Am I correct? We're not certain that this is from Irenaeus. Am I correct?
the attribution is not certain to me. Yes.
Okay, but an attribution that we can be certain of would be Irenaeus against Heresies 4:17. And if we look at that passage, does it not show that Irenaeus interprets this to be a Eucharistic prophecy?
Again, I guess if you were asking me the original question about whether there were early writings that take a view that this is not referring to the supper itself in terms of being a sacrifice of Christ, but instead refer it to us being sacrificing ourselves and offering a sacrifice of praise.
Okay.
This is an example of that. I was providing an example of that. I wasn't saying that no father ever took a different position, and I don't have in front of me the passage you're thinking of from Irenaeus to tell you whether he's talking about sacrifice of praise there or he's talking about something else.
So I don't want to misrepresent you. Let me just be certain. In reference to what you're saying, since we do have a writing from Irenaeus that shows that he does believe this to be a Eucharistic prophecy and it is not a dubious writing, this is in contrast to the only bit of proof that you can present, which would be a dubious attribution to Irenaeus. We really don't know who wrote that. We don't know if the person was even Christian or anything like that. Am I correct?
No, I wouldn't say that's correct, because you have yet to show that Irenaeus, the premise of your argument to be correct, that Irenaeus is talking about that Eucharist itself as being a sacrifice of Christ. But in any event, it's not the question of what what ancient writings there were. It's a question of what ancient writers there were. If the real important question here, of course, is not whether Irenaeus came on one side or the other of the argument, but which is the truth. And I'm very persuaded by the argument from this Lost Writings of Irenaeus.
Okay. Just to be certain, that writing that you quoted from, you're not certain who wrote it. Am I correct?
Yes. I'm correct. You're correct. It's attributed to Irenaeus. That's what I'm letting you know.
Okay. And just to be certain, the writing which is entitled Against Heresies, we are certain that it was written by Irenaeus. Am I correct?
More or less. I mean, there's a big problem with all of these very ancient patristics writings because they're subject to interpolation over the years.
So you don't believe Against Heresies was written by Irenaeus then?
You're mistaken again. I didn't say that I don't think the book was written.
No, I'm asking.
There's a problem.
I'm just asking. I'm not making the assertion.
I think Irenaeus wrote a book called Against Heresies, and I'm merely pointing out that there is a big problem of textual preservation of the patristic writings, especially the early ones, and Irenaeus is a relatively early one, because they've come down so far in so few copies and such poorly transmitted text that it's very difficult to figure out with certainty what was the original text.
Okay, that's it for my time.
Okay, Turretinfan, you can cross-examine William, and you'll have 6 minutes as of now.
Okay. Let me begin by the first point of my argument was that the sacrifice of Christ was once for all. It seemed as though you acknowledged that this is true, that the sacrifice of Christ was once for all. Am I correct in understanding that you do agree that Christ's sacrifice was once for all?
Definitely, without a doubt. I just want to be certain that I want to make the point for people that are listening. I don't want them to get the misrepresentation that perhaps they believe that I believe Christ is being re-sacrificed and that Christ did not die once for all. I do affirm exactly what the book of Hebrews says, and I affirm what the early church say as well.
The second point of my argument was that in the Roman Catholic system, there isn't a killing of Christ. Christ is not killed again. That's not the Roman Catholic view. Is not that Christ is killed again and again and again, or continuously being killed.
Correct. That is not the point. That is not Roman Catholic theology. Nor I would like to add one other point. That is also not Orthodox theology as well, since the Orthodox and the Catholic churches share this same theology in regards to the Eucharistic sacrifice of the Mass.
is there any dogmatic source of Orthodox theology that addresses the question?
Excuse me, what question are you speaking of?
Well, Trent dogmatically defines de fide, the Mass. You quoted from Ludwig Opp in your opening, if I remember correctly, and he says that, if I recall him correctly, he says Trent de fide defines that the Mass is a sacrifice.
Well, let me correct you on that. When I was quoting Ludwig Opp, even though, yes, Trent does say that, he wasn't specifically quoting Trent verbatim, but yes, he was pointing out that this is a, it's by the faith we are obliged to believe this. So I believe your question would
but
be...
there's no Trent, the Orthodox don't accept Trent as dogmatically binding. So is there some similar Orthodox council that has already said the same thing as Trent and that's binding on all Orthodox people?
Are you asking me if there is a council with a document that mirrors what Trent says, similar to that?
I'm not saying just any council. I'm not saying just any council, but one that would have to be accepted, like one of the 7 ecumenical councils.
Okay. I get the gist of your question. If you're asking me if there's, I suppose, an official dogmatic statement for the Orthodox in regards to this, no, I don't believe that it can be found in any of the 7 ecumenical councils. I am aware, though, that there were a few councils that were held a little bit after the unification and a bit after the West and the East separated, in which whereas the Orthodox and Roman Catholics would not recognize them as being dogmatic, nevertheless, in their canon of decrees, they did mention and did quote from the Eucharistic texts several times.
Okay, so let me focus this next question on the Roman Catholics view.
Sure.
Since I think we've established that you do agree that there's one sacrifice, and you do agree that Christ is not being killed again. So,
correct.
So in that case, it seems as though there's a problem, and perhaps you can help me resolve this problem of how, if there's only one sacrifice, and Christ is not continuing to be killed, how can the sacrifice continue without a death continuing?
Very good question, and I will answer that by basically reading a snippet of exactly what Chrysostom says, and I just want to point out one thing. I don't want people to misunderstand what I read when Chrysostom wrote in his work in the priesthood, when he says, when you see the Lord immolated and lying upon the altar, I want to be certain that people don't believe that the Lord is being destroyed again, he's being sacrificed again upon that altar. Because as Catholicism and the Orthodox believe, Chrysostom goes forward. He goes forward by saying, and the priest bent over that sacrifice praying, and then he mentions all the people. He then says, can you think that you were still among men and on earth? And then he goes forward to make the assertion and get to the point of what he was saying by saying, or are you lifted up to heaven? Connecting the work, the sacrifice that was once for all, connecting that with the action that is occurring on the altar of the once for all sacrifice. And he connects the event that is occurring on earth to the heavens, basically not confining it to a certain period of time. And we can find this in Chrysostom and Ambrose and in Augustine. And a number of these, Augustine deals with this specifically in his work, City of God. I don't want to take up much more of your time, though, but that's exactly how I would recommend people answer this certain objection.
I'm not sure how we're doing on time for this cross-examination. Do we still have the time?
I just got about 30 seconds.
Yeah.
Okay.
You got another question?
I think my next question might take longer than 30 seconds, so I'll just I'll let you take the next cross-examination now.
Okay. All right, William. Okay. So you have the next cross-exam, and you got 6 minutes.
Okay. Great. Turretinfan, I know we're limited in time, so I want to go over it quickly to 1 Corinthians 11, 24, and 25. Could you read that out loud, please?
1 Corinthians 11. I don't I have 25. After the same manner, also he took the cup when he had supped, saying, This cup is the New Testament in my blood. This do ye as oft as ye drink it in remembrance of me. That's the portion you wanted, or I didn't have the other one right in front of me.
That's exactly it. I wanted to ask you a question. In your theology, or in your point of view, is this event meant to be represented throughout history Or was this supper with the bread and wine meant to be a one-time commemoration?
This supper was meant to continue until the Lord comes, and that's mentioned. I don't recall the passage right now, but it's supposed to continue until the second coming.
Yeah, I think it's pretty strongly implied in that passage. But okay, you answered my question. My next question would be in Matthew 26:28, and I'm going to go ahead and read it while you get to that passage. Matthew 26:28. While they were eating, Jesus took bread, gave thanks, and broke it, and gave it to the disciples, saying, "Take and eat, this is my body." Then he took the cup, gave thanks, and offered it to them, saying, "Drink from it, all of you. This is my blood." And he goes onwards to tell us that the blood is being poured out. Why is the blood being poured out here, Turretinfan?
Why is the blood being shed? For the remission of
yes.
sins.
Okay. So in this text, let me see. So it would be being shed out for the remission of sins. Do you believe that this is a symbolic reference to blood, or is this an actual literal reference to blood?
I think that might be a little bit of a false dichotomy, but the Christ's literal blood was literally shed for the remission of literal sins. The cup, meaning the contents of the cup, the wine, represents that blood, which is shed for remission of sins. So both elements are there. There's both a symbolic aspect, the wine represents Christ's blood, and there's a literal aspect that is, it points to a reality. It points to the actual shed blood of Jesus Christ.
Where in the passage is the word represent connected to the blood and the wine?
Well, if it had used the word represent, then it would be a simile, not a metaphor. Yeah. So it's a metaphor, which means that the word like or resemble or represent. It's the same thing that Augustine was saying in the quotation you offered him.
So that's basically your interpretation of the passage. The passage should just
No, I'm sorry. I meant to say that was also Augustine's interpretation. But yeah. Okay.
Turretinfan, in the prophecy of Malachias, are you aware of any? Actually, you know what? I asked you that question already. Let me see. I actually want to read you a passage from Ambrose, and I want to get your commentary on that. Ambrose says, "Even if one does not now see that Christ is sacrificed, still he himself is sacrificed on earth. Whenever the body of Christ is sacrificed, it is obvious that he even offers himself in us. For his word sanctifies the sacrifice which is offered." And this is in his commentary on Psalms 38 and 25. He then tells us, "We are able, being priests, and we offer the sacrifice on behalf of the people." Turretinfan, what sacrifice is Ambrose speaking of here?
Oh, you may have. This is a difficult cross-examination question since I never used Ambrose, and I unfortunately don't have time in this limited scenario to kind of look up and get the whole context and figure out whether Ambrose is making a mistaken reference to the body and blood of Christ, or whether he is referring, as others have done, including me, to the sacrifice offered by the people of themselves.
Okay. Since you haven't read much of Ambrose, let's move on to Chrysostom. In his work in the priesthood, when he tells us that the Lord is immolated and lying upon the altar, and then connects that with the work of heaven, does Chrysostom believe that the Eucharist is a true, actual sacrifice in this passage?
No, I think Chrysostom is aware of the fact that this is not the sacrifice itself, but it's a remembrance of the thing. And we see that in his homily 17 on Hebrews, section 6, where he says, "What then do not we offer every day?" responding to this objection. We offer indeed, but making a remembrance of his death, and this remembrance is one and not many. How is it one and not many? Inasmuch as that sacrifice was once for all offered and carried into the Holy of Holies. This is a figure of that sacrifice, and this remembrance of that. For we always offer the same, not one sheep now and tomorrow another, but always the same thing, so that the sacrifice is one. And yet by this reasoning, since the sacrifice is made in many places, are there many Christs? The Christ is one everywhere, being complete here and complete there, also one body. So he distinguishes between although he calls it the sacrifice, because that's what it represents, he distinguishes between our remembrance of it and the thing itself.
Okay. Turretinfan, if he is making a distinction here, well, okay, that's it for my time.
Yeah.
I'll pick that up.
So this will be Turretinfan's cross-exam, and he has 6 minutes.
Okay, thanks. Turning to this question of what anamnesis means, do you agree that the translations that you provided are correct, that it means remembrance or reminder? Or do you think that those are inaccurate or misleading translations of the term?
No, I think the majority of the places where anamnesis appears, it means exactly that. It means a sacrificial remembrance, and the majority of the passages that I looked up in the New Testament meant that, and I think I just found one exception in the Septuagint. But yeah, the majority of the passages mean that.
You quoted, in fact, as an example of the use of this term, the use in verse 3 of chapter 10 of Hebrews, which I also quoted. That verse says, "But in those sacrifices, there is a remembrance again," meaning this, and that term, I think sacrifices there is probably just a translator's gloss to help make it more clear, but this remembrance word is that term anamnesis. But that term, when it says there that in those sacrifices, there is a remembrance made, can you remind us what's that remembrance made of? In Hebrews 10, verse 3. And I'll give you a second to look it up if you don't have it in front of you. I know you used it in your speech, but hopefully you have it.
Yeah, I don't have it in front of me. What was that, Hebrews 3:10 you said?
10:3.
10:3. Yeah, I don't have that open.
Okay, well, I can just read it. I'll just read it.
Yeah,
King James Version. It says, "But in those sacrifices there is a remembrance again made of sins every year." So in what sense do the sacrifices provide a remembrance of sins every year?
Yeah, Hebrews 10:3 is actually referring to sacrifices that were done under the law, and you can actually find those. You can actually find those the expositions in Leviticus 16:7. I think also 14:15, a few other verses.
Right.
But these sacrifices they differ. They differ a great deal from the usage of anamnesis in other terms, because these were sacrifices that were brought to remembrance. Specifically, in a number of these passages, if we examine them, we see that anamnesis is a sacrificial remembrance, and in these passages, a lot of the times it's in reference simply to the sins of the people, and at times it varies in the usage of the term anamnesis.
So in what sense are those sacrifices a remembrance of sin? In what sense are they a remembrance?
What do you mean? I don't quite understand. What do you mean in what sense?
Do they transport us into heaven or into hell or into purgatory? They just bring it to mind.
Oh, in this specific passage in Hebrews 10:3, yeah, definitely. It's telling us it's bringing to mind. It's a sacrificial remembrance of the sins of the people in this specific passage, because it's hearkening to the usage in Leviticus and various other passages. I believe they come up about, I want to say maybe 4 or 5 times in Leviticus in the Greek. Okay,
so to be clear, there's no claim here that the Old Testament sacrifices transported the people to some other place in which they experienced these sins.
Well, I never said that. I never claimed that.
No, I know you didn't say it. I'm making sure you don't think that.
Right.
I'm trying to nail that out of it.
So yeah, I don't think that the Greek terminology carries that with it either. Yeah. I think context is everything.
So then where do you get that meaning, which is how you explained it, that we're transported into heaven? How do you get that meaning out of the text in the other places where anamnesis is used?
Well, first off, I didn't take that meaning from other texts where anamnesis was used. I was pointing out how a number of the fathers actually did view that in their reading. For instance, Chrysostom, Augustine, Athanasius, and there are a few others, I'm sure, as well. I don't remember them off the top of my head, but I can tell you where I would connect it to. I believe a lot of them connect that to 1 Corinthians 11:26 and Luke 22:19, whereas the passages don't directly say that it's connecting it to heaven, a number of the fathers connected the Greek rendering for whenever to show that the representation of the Lord's Supper was not to be a one-time event, that the actual sacrificial meal would be a continual, ongoing event. And a number of the fathers used extremely powerful language to connect that.
For the sake of simplifying the question, let's assume that all the fathers that we can find, whose writings we still have, let's assume that they all exactly hold your position. Why are they right and not? And what's the reason why we should adopt their position, other than that they said it?
That's a great question. I appreciate it. The reason we should believe what the fathers say, and yes, I do believe they are unanimous. I even believe the passages that you read favor the Orthodox ancient Christian position. The reason I believe that we should adopt what they say is because these early fathers were taught by the apostles. They were taught by early bishops of the church. These teachings, these traditions, whether oral or written, were passed down throughout the ages, and we can see that they were preserved throughout the ages. And we can see it in Tertullian and Irenaeus and Augustine, Ambrose, Chrysostom. And when we can see that all of these beliefs in this one teaching in a unanimous way, we can adopt that knowing that it's true.
Okay, and we have William with your cross-exam of Turretinfan, and I think then we have one more cross-exam with Turretinfan, and then that'll be done with the cross-exam portion of this segment, and then we can begin with the closing statement. So, William, this is your last cross-exam.
Okay, great. Okay, I'll begin now. Okay, Turretinfan, I want to ask you, go right back to Augustine.
Okay.
Are you aware of what Augustine says in regard? And I know he brings it up a number of times, though, but in regards to his interpretation of Malachi, are you aware of what Augustine says in his City of God, 1835?
Could you
pull that up?
I've read it before, I'm sure. Yeah,
okay.
Let's see.
If you could pull that up, I'm going to read it real quick. Augustine, and it's City of God, 1835. He says, "Now I turn to Malachi, this man prophesying of the church, which by Christ's power has now expanded far and wide, takes on the person of God to say to the Jews," and I'm cutting a little bit off because I don't want to use all my time. And I'm prophesying of Malachi, "For the rising of the sun, even of the going down thereof, my name is great among the Gentiles, and in every place there is a sacrifice, and there is offered to my name a clean oblation. For my name is great among the Gentiles, says the Lord of hosts." Now, if we see that everywhere in our time, from the rising of the sun to the going down thereof, this sacrifice is being offered by Christ's priests, according to the order of Melchizedek. And as the Jews are in no position to deny their sacrifices, rejected in the first verse, have come to an end, how is it that they can be looking for another Christ? Okay, my question to you is this. Is Augustine not saying that this is the same Christ in the Eucharistic sacrifice as the Christ in Calvary?
Let me see.
Because he's telling them, how is it that they can be looking for another Christ? Excuse me, referencing directly the sacrifice being offered by Christ's priests. Is he not saying that this is the same exact Christ?
So I have it in front of me. I'm trying to. It's a little bit putting me on the spot because it's difficult to read the full context while without having this being a cross-examination of something I had actually said myself. But nevertheless, the portion that he talks about is he is talking about in this section about. Let me just make sure I'm looking at the right section. You're talking about chapter 35 of book 18. Is that right? Malachi foretelling the church, which we now behold propagated through Christ.
I'm talking in City of God, chapter 1835. But
so book 18, chapter 35, right?
Yeah, if you're unable to pull that up real quick, I can move on to another.
I have book 18, chapter 35, which is it's organized into books and then chapters. So I think I'm in the right place that you're referring to. And
okay.
And this is so. There he says. There he's addressing the question. We can already see this sacrifice offered to God in every place, from the rising of the sun to his going down, through Christ's priesthood, after the order of Melchizedek, while the Jews, to whom it was said, cannot deny that their sacrifice has ceased. So, in other words, he's pointing out that the prophecy of Malachi is being fulfilled, and
Correct.
that the Jews no longer have their temple sacrifices. Now,
Okay.
whether he's referring to the thing that I quoted earlier, or whether he's referring to the Eucharist in terms of the that's not mentioned or brought up in this part of the work.
Okay.
It just says.
I want to move to another question, since I know I've got less than 2 minutes left. I want to move to St. Ignatius of Antioch, and in his commentary on Ephesians 5:2, it's actually his letter to the church. He tells us, and I want to try and read it real quick. If you can go to that passage. He says here, Ludwig Ott specifically tells us that he's indicating the sacrificial character of the Eucharist by speaking of the same context of the Eucharist and of the altar. And then he tells us that the altar where the Eucharist is at is a place of sacrifice. And that's actually in his letter to the Philadelphians. And he uses the Greek word thusiasterion. My question to you would be, I suppose, I'm hoping you know exactly what I'm talking about, but are you aware of the Greek term thusiasterion that is employed here as being in reference to anything other than a tangible sacrifice, whether in the New Testament or in the Septuagint?
My knowledge of the term, I guess we could try to pull up a lexicon and see if it, how the usage of the term is, whether it's ever used symbolically, like the term sacrifice is used.
Right.
To speak of the living sacrifice. We could check and see it if you'd like. I need to pull up a.
You can check if you'd like. It's the Greek word for altar, which is connected to the sacrificial term thusia, and the term used by Ignatius connecting the Eucharist with the altar is the Greek word thusiasterion. And I was curious if you can point out any place in the Septuagint in the New Testament where anything other than a tangible sacrifice is connected to that term.
It's another one of these questions which is kind of cross-examining me on something outside the scope of my presentation. But off the top of my head, I wouldn't have any way to confirm or deny whether the term has some other use. But like we talked about last time, whether something has semantic domain is different from how it can be used metaphorically.
Okay, that's it for my time.
All right, Turretinfan, this is the last cross-exam, and you have 6 minutes, and you can begin right now.
Okay. Let me pull up one of the key texts here, and I believe it's mentioned in the Matthew. I think it's Matthew 26. When you had quoted to me.
Oh yeah.
About
okay. Correct.
And Matthew 26:28. So this is the blood, and here I'm using the King James version, but this is my blood of the New Testament, which is shed for many for the remission of sin.
Correct.
And you had pointed out the significance of the word ekteo, the verb
Correct.
that means shed or poured out or
the phenomenon. Yes, correct. That exact form. Yes.
Now. This term, I'm assuming you would agree with me that the significance of the term is not the movement of the liquid, in other words, the fact that the liquid is in motion, the pouring aspect, but that this is an idiom for, like we would say that someone's blood was spilled, we mean that the person was killed. Would you agree with me that that's how this word is used as an idiom for death, for being killed?
I believe that it's connected to that, but I also do believe that in this particular passage, and I just want to be certain the audience understands what you're talking about. You're referring to Matthew 26 to 28, which I brought up. And I was indicating that the present form of the participles venomenon, which appears in Luke, and ekunomenon, which appear in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, that these are referring to an action that is occurring. These are referring to an action that is occurring at that exact moment.
I'm not
Christianity, I believe, believes that the blood is being poured out at that exact moment. And before let me just answer real quick that these passages, regardless of the present form of the participle, they do not exclude a reference to the possible future as well. The Greek does allow that.
Okay, thank you for that clarification. Now, about it being used as an idiom, I wanted to make sure I caught that you were saying that, for example, this same verb is used in Matthew 23:35, where it says that upon you may come all the righteous blood shed, and that's that same verb, upon the earth, from the blood of righteous Abel until the blood of Zacharias, the son of Berechias, whom he slew between the temple and the altar. I mean, would you agree that this blood shed that's referring to here is an idiom that refers to killing the person?
Do I believe that it can be used in a figurative sense? I believe, let me sum up your question by that. Is that what you're trying to ask?
I'm not saying a figurative sense. I'm saying as an idiom for killing somebody. Shedding their blood is another way of saying killing them.
Is your question, does that appear elsewhere in the biblical text? Is that what your question is? The answer would be yes, it does appear that way in other passages. And I'm not, I just want to be certain, I'm not trying to attach a strict usage to that Greek term there. I'm simply pointing out how this is being used and how this is sacrificial language. I think that is the most important thing that I'm trying to get forward, that the usage of these terms, they're all sacrificial.
And I have a slightly different point, as you might guess. So like in Romans 3:15, it says their feet are swift to shed blood. Again, that's the point of Romans 3:15. Romans 3:15 speaks about people, evil, wicked people, as being their feet are swift to shed blood. And the point there, as in this other case about shedding blood, like Acts 22:20 says, when the blood of thy martyr Stephen was shed, I was also there standing by. And the point wasn't, the focus is that this is, the point that I'm making here is that, and I think you're agreeing with me, I just want to make sure that we're in agreement, that this can be used as an idiom for killing somebody, that shedding their blood means that their person is dying, that they're being killed, not just that they're, getting a minor flesh wound, or just that they're getting a scratch and they're bleeding.
Right. Now, I'm looking up Romans 3:15, and the form in the Greek is different. I don't remember the other.
Yeah, I'm not worried about the tense of the,
Yeah, the Greek, okay, yes, I understand what you're getting at. It can be used in a variety of different ways, correct.
So if it's being used as an idiom for killing, in other words, Jesus is saying, this blood is shed for you, meaning I'm dying for you, then if that's the case, wouldn't that undermine your argument that Jesus is not continuing to die? The verb is not continuing to happen every time the supper takes place.
Yeah, I don't believe that Christ is continuing to die. I don't believe that happens. I don't believe Christ dies over and over again. And I think the important form, the important power of the word is because we read in where this word appears in Matthew 26:28, the KJV reads, "For this is my blood of the New Testament, which is shed for many for the remission of sins." I think the important part of this is the connection to the cup, the connection to the wine being the blood of Christ and it being poured out. I think that the blood I think he's referencing the blood literally being poured out for the remission of sins, and I believe that he's referring to his blood at that exact moment in time. I think the tense fulfills that, and I think it also leaves room for, an ongoing event to be, represented. That was fast.
Time flies.
Okay. Yeah, so that ends our cross exams, and I just want to thank you, gentlemen. This is a very cordial debate, and we have our closing statements. And William, you will have the first closing statement, and Turretinfan will have the ending closing statements, and then we'll begin with the Q&A from the listeners that are listening. Just if you're listening by PC, just want you to be aware when we have the open lines for Q&A. If you want to ask questions, you can use Skype or a personal phone. The number is 347-934-0379, and all you have to do is press 1 so that you can issue your questions or comments to either William Albrecht or Turretinfan concerning the topic of today's debate. Please stay on topic. So, William, you can begin with your ending closing statements. You have 7 minutes.
Okay. Great. Thank you for that. I want to thank Turretinfan for today's debate, and as usual, a fantastic opponent. And Gus, as usual, fantastic moderating. Today we covered a number of issues, but I think what stuck out the strongest was the fact that the history of the Christian church has been consistently unanimous. Whenever the fathers spoke of the body and the blood of Christ, they connected the language with sacrificial language. They understood the sacrifice to be a real, tangible, physical sacrifice. They did not interpret this as another sacrifice, because as the scripture tells us in 1 Corinthians 11:26, for whenever you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes. The Greek tells us for whenever, literally meaning as often as. Paul here clearly noted that the representation of the Lord's Supper would not be a one-time event. The actual sacrificial meal would be a continual, ongoing event. Through a careful examination of what the early patristic sources believed, we were able to establish that the meal was meant to be perpetual, that it was indeed a sacrificial meal. As Chrysostom tells us, a connection of heaven and earth. We examined the Greek word anamnesis and the Greek word, well, briefly, thusia. Unfortunately, we didn't have enough time to go deeper into that. But what we did find was when these terms were used in the Greek fathers, they were directly plucked from Scripture to explain just how the sacrifice could be an ongoing event. But as Malachi 1 will tell us, my name will be great among the nations. From where the sun rises to where it sets, in every place incense and pure offerings will be brought to me, because my name will be great among the nations, says the Lord Almighty. The overwhelming testimony of the fathers was to interpret this passage as a reference to that sacrifice that is offered from sunrise to sunset. The testimony of the fathers and the words of the inerrant scriptures were clear. I want to applaud my opponent Turretinfan for attempting to find one early source said otherwise. Unfortunately, as he himself admitted, it was a dubious source. It was not Irenaeus, because we know what Irenaeus says in his work against heresies. I'm sure there may be manuscript differences and what have you, but there's no difference in this text where Irenaeus tells us that the Eucharistic sacrifice is being connected directly in this prophetical verse. Every early father that commented on Malachi 1:11 connected this with the Eucharistic sacrifice. How does history treat the Eucharistic sacrifice of our Lord? As we've read, Tertullian called it a participation in the sacrifice. And when he talks about celebrating the Eucharist, he tells us that it is a standing at the altar of God. The Eucharist is standing at the altar of God. Cyprian teaches that Christ, as a priest after the order of Melchizedek, offers a sacrifice to God the Father, and indeed the same sacrifice as Melchizedek offered, that is bread and wine, namely his body and his blood. He tells us that when he begins to sacrifice in the same manner, he sees Christ himself. Strong words there. Strong words there. What about Cyril of Jerusalem? In his mystagogical catechesis, he tells us that the consummation of the Eucharist was an unbloody divine service, a sacrifice of sins. The sacrificial gift, what was that? To Cyril of Jerusalem, what was that? He says it was a Christ who was slain for us. What about St. John Chrysostom? We covered what he said. And I agreed with what Turretinfan attempted to provide some sort of rebuttal, and I'm sorry, but all the rebuttal did was support our case. Because he's correct when he tells us, have therefore reverence, have reverence before the table of which we all participate, before Christ, before the sacrifice which lies on the table. So Turretinfan can say, well, I really don't know what Chrysostom's talking about. Perhaps he's talking about some, the sacrifice being offered up by the people. No, he's not. No, he's not. He says, before Christ, before the sacrifice which lies on the altar table. Doesn't get any easier than that. Ambrose says the same thing. Talking about sacrificial gifts, he tells us that it is the same Christ, the one that was sacrificed on earth, the same Christ connected throughout time. We heard a little bit about Augustine and that passage in where he talks about realities and what have you. And perhaps, I guess, maybe you could look at that and interpret that in a symbolic way, but you've got a real problem when the great Augustine comments on that passage in Malachi. And if you don't believe in the sacrifice of the Mass, you've got a real problem on your hands if you want to say that your viewpoint was similar to that of the early church, because Augustine tells us that he's going to turn to Malachi in his City of God, chapter 18. Now I turn to Malachi. He then quotes Malachi 1:11. And then what does he tell us? Who's the sacrifice being offered by? By Christ's priests, according to the order of Melchizedek. Come on. What is he talking about? You're telling me he's talking about some other than the Eucharist there? Talking about the sacrifices of other people? No. This sacrifice is being offered by Christ's priests according to the order of Melchizedek. Bread and wine, right? The body and the blood of Christ. But the Protestants say that we believe we're re-sacrificing Christ and it must be another Christ. But what does Augustine say? He says, the Jews are in no position to deny that their sacrifices, rejected in the first verse, have come to an end. Then he says, in this sacrifice, everywhere offered, excuse me, how is it that they can be looking for another Christ? Augustine recognized that this wasn't just something that resembled something. He tells us, how can they be looking for another Christ? This is the same Christ. This is what he says that. The Mass is considered to be heaven on earth and a connection to a point in time. And all the early fathers believed this. They all believed in the sacrificial context, the sacrificial reality of the Mass. And I will now surrender the rest of my time to my good friend, Turretinfan.
Okay. And thank you so much for that, William. And we will have the final closing statement from Turretinfan, and he will have 7 minutes, and you can begin right now. Hello? Turretinfan?
He might be.
That might be helpful if I took mute off. Sorry about that.
There we go.
Okay.
I speak more forcefully without it. So
yeah.
Let me begin again, please.
Okay. All right.
So this has indeed been a cordial debate, and I apologize for my troubling the time here a little bit, but I did hear one case where perhaps my argument hasn't been clearly heard. I didn't say that Roman Catholics believe that they're crucifying Christ over and over again. Quite the contrary, I said that's a big problem for Roman Catholics, because in order for the Mass to be a sacrifice, they would need to be killing a victim over and over again. But because they're not, it's not really a sacrifice. And we saw that the testament isn't a testament without the death of the testator. And that's what Scripture says, and that's what our understanding of sacrifice means. There has to be some immolation. Something has to be destroyed, given up. But Christ's body and blood aren't. He's not killed in the Mass, so it's not really a sacrifice, rationally speaking. And as well, we already saw that the Scriptures not only teach that there's only one sacrifice, but that it ceased, that it no longer continues. Now, there's the main response to this has been, well, the fathers thought otherwise unanimously. Sometimes it's thrown out unanimously, but trying to make unanimous claims it's very easy. It's easy to make them. It's much harder to actually establish them. But even if all of the extant writings of all the fathers who happen to talk about this particular subject, which isn't all the fathers, but even if all the ones we have who happen to talk about this subject all came out exactly on the same side, still the question is, were those fathers who said all these things, were they all right? And the answer to that question was, well, they got it. There was simply the only answer we were given as to why we should accept what they said as true was that they were taught this by the apostles. But there's no demonstration that they were taught this by the apostles. there's no way to establish they were taught this by the apostles. In fact, the scriptures themselves don't teach these things. And they teach just the opposite, as we've already shown, since they teach that the sacrifice is ceased, and this is a remembrance. The scriptures don't say anything about some kind of transport to heaven, although there is a sense, and Chrysostom is a wise man and a brilliant rhetorician, but although there is a sense in which the sacrament does transport us back in time and we remember something that happened, that's a very figurative way of speaking. We're not actually transported back to first century Palestine, but we are in the manner of speaking, which is actually brings us as well to the quotation we heard from Augustine from his letter 98, where he says, if sacraments have not some point of real resemblance to the things which they're called the sacraments, they wouldn't be sacraments at all. In most cases, moreover, they do, in virtue of this likeness, in virtue of the likeness, bear the names of the realities which they resemble. Notice how Augustine is very symbolic, very figurative in his discussion. He says, this is what Mr. Albrecht quoted from. And it undermines his whole position, because Augustine is explaining why you see these things in the Fathers about something being a sacrifice when all it does is actually represent it. Because we call the sacraments the things that they represent. We say that this is the cup of the New Testament in his blood, which is shed for many. We're not saying that Christ is actually being killed. And the Roman Catholics aren't saying that either, but that's what it means to shed the blood. It means to kill the person, to have the person die. He's not dying today. He died around 33 AD. He's no longer dead. He lives. But in virtue of the likeness, they bear the names of the realities which they resemble. Therefore, in a certain manner, he says, in a certain manner, the sacrament of Christ's body is Christ's body. That is a certain manner, not it is Christ's body, but in a certain manner it is. And the sacrament of Christ's blood is Christ's blood. In the same manner, the sacrament of faith is faith. You notice how, I don't know if this came out in the original quotation, but Augustine is saying that that baptism is faith in that same way, because it's called the sacrament of faith. And people don't use that term as much anymore, but they did in Augustine's day. So Augustine's extremely figurative. There's no transubstantiation of baptism into faith, and there's nothing else. This ultra-realism isn't found there. So what about Augustine's City of God, book 18, chapter 35, not chapter 18? What about that passage in Malachi? Well, it does say priesthood of Melchizedek. So does that refer to a sacrifice that's performed that represents the original sacrifice, or is it talking about something else? Maybe my understanding of that passage is wrong. Maybe he is referring to the Eucharist, and maybe he's just referring to it in the same way he talks about here, where we call it a sacrifice because it resembles the sacrifice in some point. There's a real point of resemblance between them. What about Chrysostom? Chrysostom, when he's exegeting Hebrews, when he's providing his homily on Hebrews, explicitly distinguishes between the once-for-all offering of Christ and the offerings which we call offerings of the Eucharist. He says, what then do we not offer every day? We offer indeed, but making a remembrance of his death. And this remembrance is one and not many. How is it one, not many? Inasmuch as that sacrifice was once for all offered and carried into the Holy of Holies. And here he gets extremely figurative. He says, this is a figure of that sacrifice and this remembrance of that. He distinguishes between the two, calls one a figure and a remembrance, and the other the reality to which it points. So the Fathers are far from unanimous, but even if they were absolutely unanimous, we would still need to see why they were right. We can't just rely on the fact that the Fathers, that Chrysostom uses figurative language, Augustine uses figurative language. The fact that they use figurative language was one thing, but where we really need to go back to is the fact, as we said, it's a once-for-all sacrifice. It's done, it's completed, it's ceased. And the comparison between Hebrews 10, 1 through 3, which talks about how the old sacrifices reminded us every year, never anamnesis, which came out in the debate, that's a reminder, something that reminds you of your sins. It didn't bring those sins back from the past into the present, literally. It just reminded people of the fact that they had sins. But now, with Christ's sacrifice, although we remember his sacrifice, God promises that, let me just read the text. It says, this is the covenant I will make with them after those days, says the Lord. I'll put my laws into their hearts, and in their minds will I write them, and their sins and iniquities will I remember no more. Now, where remission of these is, there is no more offering for sin. So the Mass is the sacrifice, as I said, of us. We bring ourselves to the altar, but we do not offer Christ again. He's been once offered, and that it is finished. That is my closing speech.
Okay. So thank you both for this very cordial debate and very edifying debate, I think.
Thank you.
And I just want to invite our listeners, because we're going to now be taking questions and comments from those that are listening. If you have a question or comment to either of these gentlemen, the number is 347-934-0379 and press 1. We have about 24 minutes to take your Q&A, and I want to also remind our listeners that next week we're going to be interviewing author Carrie B., and her book is Paradise Bound, and so that'll be next week's program. And we have a lot of exciting programs coming up in the next couple of weeks. And so we do have someone who has pressed 1 and 830, you are on the air. And who do you want to issue your question to? Is it both or to just one of the debaters?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes,
Okay, this question is for William Albrecht, and I want to ask, does sacrifice mean that something must be destroyed?
Okay. That's a good question. That's a really good question. And I know it came up earlier in the debate. I know no sacrifice does not have the strict meaning of something having to be destroyed. I don't think that I don't think that would be a responsible interpretation of the term sacrifice. And if we actually study rabbinical literature, we can see many different usages of the term sacrifice, and a plethora of them never deal with something being destroyed. So that is not part and parcel with the term for thusia, which would be sacrifice. And I would recommend anybody, I think a better source than myself would be looking into the Jewish Encyclopedia, look up the term sacrifice. If you don't own the hard copy, I'm pretty sure you can find it online. You'll see a number of references to the usage of what sacrifices were in the Old Testament under the Mosaic Law and what have you. Hope that gets to the point of the question.
I have a question concerning that. I guess in this sense, then, destroyed, when we're dealing with annihilationists, of course, annihilationists take the term destroyed to mean completely, I guess, eradicated. And we know that Jesus wasn't completely eradicated in his sacrifice. He was destroyed in the sense that he was butchered.
Yeah.
Is that a more applicable, I guess, interpretation of the term destroyed? I think that people are implying here.
You want to go first, Turkman?
You can go first, I'll follow up.
I think you bring up a really good point, Gus, and I think it gets really to the heart of the problem within annihilationist theology. And I think that, I know we're going a little bit off on a tangent here, but I think you bring up a good point because they take that term destroyed and they run with it into trying to say, look, we have this, something that's destroyed, it must be annihilated, and they go on and on and on with that. And if we study what the Scripture is telling us, it really doesn't mean that. In another passage, something can be destroyed and it can continue to, an action can continue to affect that thing that was said to have been so-called destroyed. And we can look at the early rabbinical literature that tells us the same thing, as well as the early patristic sources. They say pretty much the same thing in regards to that.
Did you want to make a comment on that?
Yeah, Turkey, comment on that.
Yeah, so to provide my comment, so I agree with you that destroyed doesn't necessarily mean to render something non-existent, and
right.
Of course, rendering something non-existent wasn't even a possibility for the ancients. They didn't have the concept of matter and antimatter changing something to energy, or even that
right.
isn't complete, absolute annihilation. there's still energy left at the end of the process. So this idea of annihilation didn't really enter into their minds. I guess there's senses in which things are kind of really quite thoroughly destroyed or chewed up or burned with fire into ashes and so forth. But when it comes to and some different sacrifices involved different levels of destruction. So some of them were just a matter of killing the animal, and then you kind of cook it and eat it. And some of them were whole burnt offerings where it was completely burned up. So there's a semantic range there. But in all sacrifices, within as the general rule, anyhow, there's a victim. That's why, if you remember, when Abraham took Isaac up onto the mount, Isaac at some point said, we have the wood, but where's the victim? Where's the lamb for the offering? And Abraham told him that God would provide one. But the point is, he was well aware that a sacrifice needs a victim, and there has to be a death involved. So that's where that's coming from, not just from kind of a comprehensive word study of the term of sacrifice. And I've heard similar things from Roman Catholic sources, so I don't think it's that widely disputed.
If someone doesn't have a question, I'm going to go ahead with having a question. But the number is 347-934-0379, and just press 1 to share a comment or ask a question from either of these gentlemen who gave their two sides of the debate. In the meantime, I do have a question for Turretinfan. You began the debate with an uncertainty as to whether the Catholic Church actually intimates that it is re-sacrificing Jesus Christ. And then I think somewhere along in the debate you became solidified that they are not doing that. And then you posited, I think, towards your closing statements that it would require that they do believe in re-sacrifice for this to be a sacrifice by definition. I don't know how much Catholic literature have you ever read, but I'm just going to read just a portion of a little book I have called "The Faith Explained" by Leo J. Tracy, and this is page 312. And I really don't understand why the issue of re-sacrifice continues to come up, and why it does require re-sacrifice based upon what I'm going to read right here. And it's page 312 of The Faith Explained. And I'm just going to try to read as fast as I can. It says, the human priest, however, is but a secondary figure. It is Jesus himself who really represents God's people, a people purchased with his own blood. It is Jesus himself who is the real priest in every Mass. Jesus the priest offering himself. Jesus the victim to God for all of us. The human priest simply is the agent of Jesus. By the sacrament of holy orders, Jesus has designated and empowered this man to be his free and cooperating instrument, to speak the words by which Jesus, at this particular point in time and space, will renew for us the offering of himself upon the cross. That is where the destruction of the victim takes place on the cross. Each individual Mass is not a new sacrifice in which Jesus dies anew. Each Mass is but a continuation, a prolongation through time of the once-for-all death of Christ upon the cross. To use a modern term, we might say that the Mass reactivates for us the sacrifice of Calvary. The Mass makes present and effective for us, right here and now, the victim on the altar of the cross. The death of Jesus is more than a mere fact of history. It is an eternal sacrifice. There are no yesterdays with God. In the infinite mind of God, to whom all things past are present, Jesus hangs eternally upon the cross. So in reading that, I don't know what you would gather, but I'll explain what I gather, but I want to hear your interpretation of what you just heard me read from a Catholic. It's basically it's not the Catholic Catechism, but it is a catechetical type of book that the Catholic Church puts out by this gentleman called Leo J. Tracy.
Okay. Well, we just want to clarify something. I didn't. I may have been unclear in my original presentation, but I was saying that the Roman Catholics are caught in a dilemma. The horns of the dilemma are either they can say that Christ is being re-sacrificed, so that there's sacrifices plural, and not just one sacrifice, that somehow mysteriously one sacrifice repeated many times, or not even repeated many times, but somehow brought through time travel brought it from the past into the present. And I don't mean time travel to be disparaging. There's no kind of clear analog that could be provided to this idea of bringing it in there. I think that Mr. Albrecht's example of trying to bring us up to heaven is probably probably the best way of trying to describe it. But even if that's what's meant, they're still stuck with either saying that if they're not saying that Christ's sacrifice is repeated, then they're stuck with the problem they don't have a death in the Mass. And if they're saying that that there is a death in the Mass, then it sure looks like Christ is dying continuously, and yet that's denied, that he's dying continuously. So I was positing a dilemma that they're stuck between one or the other, and they do deny both. I think I may have said that in my opening statement. They deny that they're repeating the sacrifice, and they deny that they're killing Christ. But they're kind of stuck. They can't have it both ways and still call the sacrifice proper. It could still be one like we call the supper, a sacrifice as a metaphor or as a simile, depending on how we express it, but figuratively. So these kind of catechismal statements, or whether they're in the Catechism of the Catholic Church or in any of the less highly sanctioned ones, can't really stand up, unfortunately, to things like the Council of Trent, which in its decree concerning purgatory said, he says, but this is in the decree concerning purgatory in the 25th session. It says, but let the bishop take care that the suffrages of the faithful who are living, to wit, the sacrifices, plural, of masses, prayers, alms, and other works of piety, and so forth, be performed, and so on. The idea being that you perform these, but the idea you perform those to help people who are in purgatory eventually be purified and leave purgatory. But the key word that I want to focus in is that they use that plural form, sacrifices, plural. So I suppose there might be some way to try to just reconcile that with the idea that Rome doesn't have that there's a plurality of sacrifices and there's only one sacrifice. That looks like an acknowledgement that masses plural have sacrifices plural. Whether that's the direct, and if they go that way, then the scriptures clearly lock it down. But I think that's probably a disputed point, and the example you provided is just one of many examples you could provide where Roman Catholic sources, often not dogmatic sources, but many of these sources will explicitly say that they think there's only one sacrifice and there's not a plurality of sacrifices. So, I think the problem is that there's a dilemma and tension.
Yeah, let me ask William this.
I can comment on that real quick.
Go ahead, William.
Yeah, I wanted to comment real quickly on his reference to the quotation from Trent. And I think it's a real good point that he brings that up. It does say, but let the bishop take care, and it does go forward as quoting plural sacrifices. But if anybody has, and I've got it right here on my right-hand side, the Catechism of the Council of Trent, not only in a footnote, but directly there in the context, we read that what is being referred to are sacrifices, and it's being directly plucked from the book of Hebrews, where the plural form of sacrifices does appear. So it's not like this is being just completely, pulled out of thin air, and we're trying to speak about multiple sacrifices, Christ being sacrificed over and over. I think what's really important is always context. And if somebody really wants, to understand the Council of Trent, I would definitely recommend they get a hold of the Catechism of the Council of Trent. It's much more in depth. And another point he brought up, actually, it was brought up earlier. He brought it up a little while ago. And I didn't want him to get confused on my point. I think the caller asked if, I think the question was, does something have to be destroyed in order for it to be a sacrifice, or something along those lines? And I recommended that they go to the Jewish Encyclopedia, where they'll see that, without even going in depth to the Greek term, Dosia, for sacrifice. Just look it up. Read Leviticus chapter 7. You're going to see a number of areas where sacrifice is brought up, and you don't need to have something being killed, something being murdered, something being destroyed. There are a number of different types of sacrifices that are brought up. For instance, a wave sacrifice, a number of different ones brought up that are different types of sacrifices, different types of peace offerings. And again, it varies. And again, I would recommend people that hear this debate really go and, read in their own. I mean, these debates are for people to really, become edified by the Word of God and look it up and, see what the Word is telling us.
I guess a brief comment of how I've perceived this from reading both the Current Catholic Catechism and Leo Treacy's book is until I read both of those, in their context, I always had this identification that Catholicism taught that it was, performing another sacrifice. But I think there's a key word that the Catechism uses, and it's the word perpetuity. And I think that's critical in this dialogue concerning the Eucharist debate, and that is that it's possible and even plausible that this sacrifice that is taking place at the altar in Mass is not one performed by the priest. That is, the priest is not killing Jesus Christ. If this is the sacrifice of perpetuity, that is, that we are being taken back to Calvary's cross. We are witnesses there at the foot of the cross, along with Mary and John and the apostles and the centurion. If we are all there and being present there, then not only are we not the ones that are victimizing Jesus Christ, we're not the ones that are slaying him or destroying him. The Romans are still the ones, the culprits of Jesus' sacrifice. And not only that, not even they are, because according to Treacy's book, Christ is the one who is offering himself freely. Christ is the one who could have come down from the cross, but he didn't. And so I think that really, the word perpetuity, I think, really changed this element from this idea, identification with the Catholic Mass as being heretical, which is a lot of Protestants do believe it's heretical, to something that is absolutely can be within the pale of orthodoxy of acceptable, because it's defining what that one sacrifice was. That sacrifice is not one that we're liable, we don't have bloody hands, but we are actually beneficiaries of it because God and that's one thing that I loved about the Catholic Church, is that it uses the term divine mystery a great deal. And as a former Jehovah's Witness, we ran away from the term divine mystery. Is that mysteriously we are being taken there, mystically we are there, and so I think that's an element that is sometimes overlooked and overlooked over and over and over again, and to produce what might possibly be a straw man and in some cases a poisoning the well fallacy. But you guys
can I point out?
Free to make comments on that.
If I could point out there's a sense in which even the kind of Reformed view on the sacrament does bring us back there to Calvary, and does in the sense that it reminds us of Christ's death, and it's a memorial meal, and it's a reminder, a continual reminder of what happened. But that's a sense which the Roman Catholics, which doesn't go as far enough for Roman Catholic dogma. In other words, it's not enough to have that symbolic meaning.
Right.
The problem is if you make it real, if you make it a real return to the cross, so that we're really there, then the problem seems to be in that word remembrance, right? Because if you're actually there at the cross, you're not remembering, you're seeing. No one says that that they're remembering what's right in front of them. They're seeing what's right in front of them. So the problem with that explanation of I applaud the attempts to kind of try to reconcile the two sides in that way. But the problem is then the remembrance aspect goes away, because it's no longer a remembrance. Now it's a representation. In other words, making it present.
I think that's a good point. I think Turretinfan brings up a good point in that we do differ in that greatly. I think, as far apart as we are, I do think that there are some similarities as well. And I think that, I would argue from the Catholic perspective, and I would argue that my Orthodox brethren would probably agree with me that, we do fall on the side of saying, this is going to be continually represented. We won't stop and point to that, to the Greek term "nomnesis" only. We agree that the Greek term "nomnesis" is sacrificial remembrance. But as a Catholic, I would say, 1 Corinthians 11:26, it's clear that for whenever we practice this, and there are other terms that give the language of a sacrificial representation. And I would argue not only specifically just the Greek term "nomnesis," and a number of fathers I know. I think the first one that hopped on it, I believe, was Chrysostom, and then a number of fathers afterwards in trying to connect the heaven and earth parallel. They quoted Revelation 13:8, which quotes the Lamb who was slain from the creation of the world. And we've got a number of fathers that adopted this passage and gave it a Eucharistic interpretation, very strong. In fact, coming into the Nicene era and post-Nicene era, a number of fathers quoted Revelation 13:8 to quote just how we can be there on Calvary and experiencing heaven on earth. But I think Turretinfan and Gus bring up a lot of good points. I think whereas we are close on a lot of the terminology, we're quite far apart as well. And we can all pray for unity, but the reality is we are far apart on issues such as these here.
Just want to remind our listeners, if you want to go ahead and chime in on this discussion and Q&A, the number is 347-934-0379. Press 1. We have only 7 minutes remaining, so, as they say, speak now or hold your peace.
Yeah, people usually press the button right when time's running up.
Yeah, exactly. It's like the last 9 seconds, and then all of a sudden somebody hits 1. So I just want to remind our listeners that press 1, and we have only a limited amount of time, but I want to make sure that you guys get what you want to say or share. Actually, before this debate, I had just finished reading an article by an Orthodox priest on the issue of sacrifice of the Mass, and basically the point that he had made in the article was that he sounded very Lutheran in certain respects, and what I mean by that is that Lutherans love to take a position that's a non-position. Lutherans just say, we're not sure. Yeah, we like the language this way. We agree with the language, but we're not going to really try to explain anything. And the Orthodox position is that they feel that their Catholic brothers went too far in trying to explain things too detailed, things that were already always accepted, and the mystery of those things were accepted, and the language of those things. Of course, they still agree, of course, that it is a non-bloody sacrifice with the Catholic Church, and they don't like labeling things like transubstantiation or memorialist position or consubstantiation, but they are no doubt in the transubstantiation agreement. We want to make sure we get our listeners on. So we do have someone who press 1, and you're on the air, 830.
Yes, for William, you brought up Revelation 13. What is the earliest source for that?
Excuse me. Oh, okay. Yeah, I brought up Revelation 13, I believe 13:8. As far as I know, I'm going to say, the earliest source that I know of is actually probably the first extant Greek commentary that does exist, and it's from Oecumenius. He does quote Revelation 13:8. He connects that. He uses the parallel of Melchizedek, and he connects this passage with Eucharist. I don't know what the earliest connection of this passage to the Eucharistic text would be, but I do know that the earliest extant Greek commentary on the book of Revelation does bring up this passage, and it does connect it with, Revelation 13:8 was the Eucharist, and it does, it gives a very strong Catholic interpretation to it. Hope that helps.
Could you, I don't know if you haven't, could you read Revelation 13:8?
Yeah, definitely. Revelation 13:8. Let me pull that up so I can read it exactly for you. Okay, here we go. It's talking about, and this is specifically in reference to the fathers using this passage to show a connection between heaven and earth and being directly present at the altar of heaven with the Eucharistic sacrifice. Revelation 13:8, the KJV reads, "And all that dwell upon the earth shall worship him, whose names are not written in the book of life of the Lamb, slain from the foundation of the world." And in reference to this passage, the fathers were strong in adopting a point of view that the Lamb slain from the foundation of the world was a direct prophetic connection to that of Christ in the Eucharist. And as far as I know, the earliest extant Greek commentary on this book, and the book of Revelation, does give that exact commentary. I don't know what the earliest would be, but the earliest Greek commentary on the book of Revelation, it does cover that.
Okay, I'm going to take a look at my ancient Christian commentary. I have that. That's a Protestant commentary of the early church.
Oh, okay.
There's a new, you may be happy to hear about this, Mr. Albrecht, that there is a new commentary that's been released just in the last year that publishes what's now viewed as the earliest extant, which actually predates the one that you're talking about, I believe. I did
not know that.
But it's fragmentary, so it's not a complete commentary. And I have a copy of it, but not unfortunately in front of me. Or I would have, if I had known this was going to come up, I would have had it in front of me. I apologize, I don't have it here.
Yeah, if you could provide me with that,
I'll send you offline some information about it. Yeah.
I'd love to get
offline.
I will. Definitely, I appreciate that.
Okay, well, we're down to the last 2 minutes of the program, so if anyone has any question or comment, the number is 347-934-0379. Press 1. In the meantime, I just want a quick plug for my sponsor, Audible.com. If you want to get a free month trial and a free audiobook, go to audibletrial.com/healing, the letter X, and the outreach. And that's one way you could support our program here on Healing X Outreach. Also, if you're listening by iTunes, please, if there's a particular program that you really enjoyed, make some comments about that in iTunes, and also make some comments on it on our archives. Some information, any comments, anybody that if you need any counseling, if you're coming from a particular cult, or how to deal with your relatives, you can reach me at healingxoutreach@yahoo.com, and P.O. Box 56, Marbury, Maryland, 20658 is the outreach mailbox. So if you want to snail mail me or anything, reach me there. I want to thank both William Albrecht and Turretinfan for a very edifying debate and discussion after debate. That was
definitely.
That was very edifying. And I'll remind everybody we will be on next week at 12 noon with Carrie B., author of Paradise Bound, and we have some great programming in store in September. Be sure, if you are in the Pennsylvania area, there's a Witnesses Now for Jesus conference. I'll be speaking on Friday, the 26th, on the cross, the cross of Christ, foolishness or God's wisdom of grace is the title of my talk on the 26th. And the 26th, the 27th, and the 28th is the dates of the conference in New Ringo, Pennsylvania. Just Google Witnesses Now for Jesus Convention, and I believe, and you could also see it on Ustream. So check us out on Ustream. If you're not able to go, you'll be able to hear all the talks online. And They'll also be on YouTube, so just Google Witnesses Now for Jesus Convention there. Without further ado, I just thank everyone. You all have a great weekend, and see you next week on Healing X Outreach at blogtalkradio.com. You all have a great weekend. Bye-bye.